Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. Today I sat down with my friend Tsu-Yin Chang. I met Tsu-Yin at the Shipibo Healing Center in the Amazon, the Temple of the Way of Light. She came down as a guest to work with ayahuasca, and I find her story very interesting. She's a long-term meditator. She actually led a monastic life for a while, and she has a practice based in mindfulness-based psychotherapy. So she's also really fascinated into the world of the mind and her own journey in that and helping others with that. And she's recently done the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, I believe it is. They have a program where people are becoming licensed now to work with some of these plants in a clinical way, and she's working with MDMA, and especially beginning to help war veterans. That's a really big area that's been studied with the efficacy of that medicine. And according to her, what she brought up was pretty staggering. The results of 2 and 3 veterans have actually been cured of their PTSD with that. So really fascinating. She's a really interesting woman. I really enjoy talking to her, kind of also beginning to bridge these two worlds. So it was a really good conversation. I think it was also fairly long, 2.5, 3 hours. But I think you guys will get a lot out of it. So as always, if you can, if you enjoy the podcast, if you can go on YouTube and hit the subscribe button, and if you're able to go on Apple Podcasts and leave a starred rating and a review, that would be really helpful in getting this show out. So without further ado, here is the interview. All right, so we're recording. All right, so yeah, welcome. It's good to see you.
Likewise, it's really good to see you, Jason.
So you're coming from Boston, where you're from?
Yeah, I'm not originally from Boston. I grew up in North Carolina, but here I am right now.
Yeah. So you have an interesting story. You're a psychotherapist, but you, from what I remember talking to you, you spent a long time in a monastery, I think a Buddhist monastery. How did that come about?
Wow, that's a long story. I'll try.
We've got time.
I'll try to keep. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think that it's really interesting to note that in kind of the first part of my life, I really had very little interest in spirituality or anything religious or plant medicines or being ordained as a Buddhist nun. So there was an interesting shift that happened when, because of a very stressful job when I was first out of grad school, I started meditating just for stress reduction purposes. And I have to thank that job for being so stressful, because it really helped me cultivate a steady meditation practice, which is quite difficult to do. And I was initially, aside from being able to get the stress down, I was initially really taken by the fact that I was having all of these insights just about my personal psychology, which, you know, I was a psychology major and thought of myself as somebody who was really self-aware at that time. And meditation, the kind that I was practicing, which is insight meditation, kind of an American Vipassana style. That's, you're not adding anything to your experience, you're just simply observing it. So meditation in that way revealed to me all of these facets of myself that I just didn't realize were there. So I was really fascinated by the way that that could happen. And so I was drawn deeper into it. And eventually at some point, I kind of felt like, oh, wow, is this getting spiritual? Is this what spirituality is? And I can't even describe it, because spirituality is very difficult to describe beyond the concepts that we have in language. And I didn't have any precedent for looking out for it or thinking about it, but it just at some point felt like, wow, I feel like I'm getting a real understanding of the world and beyond myself that I didn't have before. So it kind of started out that way, and just many years later, it kept on revealing more and more layers were peeled back. And I was at that point sitting many meditation retreats, and I had just come out of a 3-month meditation retreat in Massachusetts. At that time I was living in Seattle, but I had flown to Massachusetts to do this annual retreat that the Insight Meditation Society has. And the retreat after that, the next year, I had an experience that was far beyond what my conceptual thinking mind could understand. And so then that's when I realized I needed to devote all of my resources and attention to really understanding deeply what that was, that there was nothing more important than that.
How would you describe that to people who maybe have or haven't had that experience? You said something, you had an experience beyond what your conceptual mind could understand?
Mm-hmm. Yes, which also makes it difficult to describe to people who haven't had that experience. It really shook my understanding of, up until that point, the way that the world worked, the mind worked, really on kind of like a metaphysical level. And it was far beyond what I ever could have imagined existed. And just from doing this simple practice that I had been doing the whole time. And so it was just fascinating to I was very thrown by it, and I didn't want to talk about it for a really long time. And the first time I did, it was like very, very tender and very shaky. And there was just a sense of knowing that there's no other way to say it. The way that I perceived the world was incorrect before that point.
Yeah. So you said you majored in psychology. What drew you to that?
Yeah, I've always, ever since I was young, been quite interested in human behavior, trying to understand why people act the way they do and do the things that they do. And yeah, starting from my first semester freshman year, I took a psychology class, and I would just come back to the dorm at night and just talk nonstop about it to the people that lived in my hallway. It was just deeply fascinating to me.
And so with psychology, were you interested in the human mind, or were you interested in your own process, or interested in helping people, or some combination of all of those?
I would say back then, when I was an 18-year-old, I was only interested in the human mind. I didn't have enough awareness about my own process at that point. And I didn't see it as it was more that I wanted to immerse myself in that understanding, and I didn't know what would come out of it. I didn't have a strong feeling that I needed to make a career out of helping people.
So you were interested more in your own mind, in your own process. How did that lead to you then starting a practice?
So I wasn't quite interested in my own mind back when I was a psychology major, but later. And do you mean a private practice like I currently have, or a meditation or spiritual practice? Which one?
Yeah, a private practice.
Oh man, you're asking me to dip into kind of a personal history that's like jumping 10 years between each one, but I'll try. So just very broadly, and feel free to ask me more questions if you're interested. Very broadly, after I came back from a couple of years of Buddhist monastic training, I had before that already been practicing as a psychotherapist after studying psychology. I also went to grad school for clinical social work, which is a way of understanding the same thing, human behavior, and why people are the way they are, but also by looking at environmental factors in a way that's not so pathology oriented like the Western psychological model often is. And so I had actually been working as a therapist the whole time during that period where I got really into meditation and it became spiritual and was going to all of these retreats. So when I had that mind-blowing experience, and then I decided that I just needed to drop everything and immerse myself in this understanding, I decided that I would take Buddhist nun robes in Asia, and that I would have to end all of my therapeutic relationships with my clients. And so after I came back from Asia, there was an obvious sense, not immediately, I think, I think when I decided that it was time, it was okay to go, to leave the monastic setting, I think I would have been okay just like working in a small bakery in Cambodia or something, like for the rest of my life. But it really felt at some point circumstances were such that I ended up in Boston. I fell in love with a person who is now a friend that's very dear to me. And eventually it just felt like a really natural thing to kind of express more of my understanding in a relational context with people other than my partner at that time. And I had always been very passionate about psychotherapy, and I felt deeply the complementary nature of meditation and psychotherapy from the beginning. So it felt pretty obvious that I should just start a private practice, and it happened really quickly as things started to do. When I was in Asia, I kind of somehow morphed into this new way of being where I never felt the need to plan anything anymore, which was very different from my younger self, which was very, very plan focused. and way of being, and everything just became obvious. It became obvious what I should do at any given point. All right. So when I was in Boston and spending all day at home, there was just something that happened, and my partner at the time came home from work because he had a real job, and I was like, hey, look at my new website for my private practice. And he was just like, what? That's crazy, because we hadn't talked about it. It hadn't occurred to me before that point.
So you were trained in psychology. You studied a lot of mindfulness. How do you find that those two things intertwine, and how do you find that useful in a psychotherapeutical practice?
Yeah, so at the heart of both disciplines, where it feels to me, my take on it is that we're trying to sort through all of the things that stand in the way of us being a truer version of ourselves. And a lot of the difficulty in that lies in the fact that it's those things that we sort through are often mostly unconscious to us. And there is a real benefit in psychology where you have this other person that's trained, and at least the way that I was trained, to see very unconscious factors influencing a person's behavior. And with meditation, like I said, I had the firsthand experience almost immediately the weekend that I started, that a lot of things that I hadn't realized fully in my conscious thinking mind were coming up, and they seemed so obvious and true, just about my own life and my problems back then and my relationships and what I should do. So I immediately saw that this aspect of uncovering this stuff to get to some deeper level content was what connected these two disciplines for me. And you know, both areas had this effect of what was uncovered was deeply shocking. it was really surprising, and I just felt like, wow, how amazing that this can be possible. And I could see how beneficial it was for my own life to actually understand these things more. And so it seemed really obvious, and it was not even a conscious, intentional thing, that I started bringing elements of the mindfulness meditation even before I left for Asia into my work with my therapy clients.
You mentioned this idea of a lot of people's issues come up from the unconscious. What would be an example, not necessarily from your own experience, but from working with someone, for example, what is something that's unconscious that would be affecting someone?
Yeah. So it happens all the time. So I'm trying to think. It's like I'm constantly seeing it. So it's not unusual for me. So strangely, it's so commonplace that it's hard for me to think of an example. But it would be like somebody comes home from work in days where we used to go to work, and the place is different from our homes. So somebody comes home from work and their dog or their neighbor's dog comes up to them, and the person kicks the dog away. And in that person's mind, there's just this sense of, wow, this dog is really irritating. I didn't want anything to do with it, and what's it doing on my porch, right? Usually, if that's something like that happens and the person is so unaware, it's like they don't realize that they actually had a terrible day at work. And maybe they had a difficult conversation with their boss, or something happened where they heard there might be some layoffs coming up or something like that. And so when they enter the house, it's so unconscious, because that prospect is a little bit terrifying and overwhelming to think about. Not having a job, for example, not having that stability. And maybe the partner says, "How was work, honey?" And he just says, "It was fine." Right? So there's not an actual integration of a difficult emotional event into the conscious mind of the person, and it comes out in various different ways.
So
Okay.
if someone, for example, had something that was unconscious, that they obviously it's unconscious, so they're not aware of it. How would a process of mindfulness help them to resolve that?
Well, I think that they have to first want to, or be ready to resolve it, right? If there's not that intention or desire, no matter how much mindfulness practice they do, it probably won't surface, right? So it's probably very similar to ayahuasca work, in which people can, buy the plane ticket and book the retreat down in Peru and get there, go through the actions of drinking, but for some reason, many ceremonies in, nothing is happening. So from a psychological standpoint, that's an indication that the psyche that's trying to protect us all the time thinks it needs to continue to protect us and hold a potentially overwhelming emotional memory or feeling at bay. So if a person is maybe kind of further along in their process, and perhaps seeing that there's something down there that's kind of driving their behavior, or they're simply just not as happy as they could be, or they feel very restless, then they're starting to see the downsides of keeping that unconscious material repressed. And so if a person is at that place, then they might for the first time seek out a therapist, or they might decide, okay, maybe do some meditation, not even consciously knowing that there's something down there, but just to calm the whole system. So what happens in meditation is that we're repeatedly, it's a very, very simple process where you focus the mind on some particular task, and it can be any task. The purpose is not to master the task, it's to see what happens when the mind is assigned this task and when it moves away from it. And when we start to just simply observe that and just kind of staying put, we really begin to peel back the layers and see what the mind is doing. So for example, when people first start meditating or decide to sit down and maybe even do it for 5 minutes, they'll sit down and immediately be like, oh yeah, I forgot to water the plants. I gotta go do that before I can meditate. Or, oh, I need to email that person. That's really important. I'm gonna forget, right? So when you're actually committed to staying put no matter what, you lose that belief that it's so important in that time to go do that thing. And then you're kind of left with this maybe anxiety that's underneath, and that was not obvious to you before. So then you're kind of just working with that anxiety and being able to tolerate it essentially more and more. Then eventually you might see that, you know, that anxiety is, for example, linked to one time 5 years ago when you didn't get back to somebody quickly enough, and they offered this great job opportunity to somebody else, something like that.
And by becoming aware of that, by bringing that into the conscious, you feel then there's the ability to resolve that.
Yeah, it's strikingly effective. Once somebody understands consciously why they have this particular compulsion, then they have the capacity usually to see like, oh, that compulsive way of responding to a situation doesn't actually apply in these other situations. In fact, maybe sometimes it's even making those situations worse. So there's, I mean, it depends. If what comes up is say severely traumatic, then you have to do a lot of healing work around that. Simply seeing it is going to send you into a tailspin. So that is not a situation in which you're like, oh, I don't have to be afraid of men anymore. You know, not all men will take advantage of me sexually, or whatever the trauma is.
Mm-hmm. So with your work, how do you begin to bring someone into a state where they are able to become aware of these unconscious patterns?
Yeah, great question. It's completely different for everybody. Like I said, everybody is at the place where I think they're supposed to be at in their personal development and their process. And so the work that I do with clients, it's funny, I often have the thought that if one client saw me working with another client, they wouldn't recognize the therapist that I was, because it really feels like what I'm doing is in response to the specificity of the moment. So it could even look different with the same client from session to session. But I think the theme is to create some sense of calm within the person. So if that's some sort of meditative thing, and that I think that would actually be feasible for a person, then I might suggest it. I usually don't. I usually let the client guide that and ask me like, hey, could you teach me how to meditate? All right, because like I said, you have to want to. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And other than that, it's kind of it's kind of an energetic thing. Like it's even happening right now. I think that there's this, this is going to sound very woo-woo for some people, but there's a field of energy here that I can access. I think you can probably access even through this medium, where if somebody's energy is kind of like frenetic or like just simply being in a presence of a less frenetic energy will kind of sync them a little bit. So it's not something that I'm even consciously doing, and I don't even think that the client usually knows that it's happening.
Mm-hmm. What would you say? I mean, I'm sure people come to you for all sorts of different reasons, but what would you say are some of the common themes or archetypes of why someone would search out not just psychotherapy, but someone who's based in mindfulness as well?
Yeah, I think so. This is such an interesting question, and the concept of readiness really still applies here. Also, because when we start to uncover these unconscious patterns and unconscious behaviors and feelings, it is not a fun process. It's not pleasant, right? The what we call the egoic thinking mind is not really jazzed about, you know, going into unacknowledged narcissism or unexpressed grief, right? Or deeply unfelt sadness. So those things aren't something that the egoic mind usually willingly turns towards. So it's typically that something, some major event has really shaken a person. It could be a death of somebody, it could be a divorce, it could be, doesn't have to be so dramatic, but it could just be somebody realizing, wow, I'm just not happy, and yeah, I can't seem to find a job that I can flourish in, right? So there's some understanding that one is not operating at their highest potential, whatever they think that means. And so it takes a great humility, I think, to acknowledge that and seek out some other way of approaching the situation. It doesn't have to be psychotherapy, right? It could be some other thing. But somebody has to have seen the limits of their current coping mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this idea that some of these egoic things or some of these patterns, the ego doesn't necessarily want to go into. Why do you think that is? Is that a protective mechanism, or what is going on there?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So the ego gets a really bad rap unnecessarily and unhelpfully, I think, in spirituality, in psychology, in society, right? The idea of somebody having a big ego is, I feel like, a complete misinterpretation of what we're supposed to be paying attention to. But there's just a sense of honestly, it's usually the things that we're turning away from were sort of trained into us when we were quite young. We probably don't even remember the actual circumstances in which they happened in our family or with people that were usually in charge of our safety, so adults probably. And at that point in time, they probably were really helpful. So for example, if you had a mother that was really depressed and never getting out of bed and never in a good mood, wasn't obvious that she really loved you because she couldn't focus on very much aside from her depression, not her fault, then you, as this very sensitive child that can absorb and read people really well, then maybe one day you clean your room and your mother perks up and she gives you some sort of validation around that. And so then you learn like, oh, maybe it's not even to gain that love, maybe it's just to make her happy. You just want to see her spirit lifted. So I don't know, you could continue to become really good at taking care of your household functions, or you could become a comedian and start cracking jokes all the time. A lot of current very successful comedians had very difficult childhoods, and you can see that they're so good at comedy because it felt like the survival mechanism when they were young.
Mm-hmm.
So it's painful stuff, but when it gets rooted in there, it's an appropriate protective mechanism, right? If I just crack a joke, to my mother, I don't have to be left with this feeling of despair of this mother who I love just being in bed all day, right? I can continually do things to make her happy. So it's really painful stuff if you trace it all the way back.
Mm-hmm. And as one begins to go into these things or learn from them, do you think there are tools that one learns to be able to slowly do that work on their own? Or is it beneficial to continue to work with someone, maybe with less frequency? Or kind of what is the long-term trajectory for that?
Yeah, it really is. It depends. It's case by case. For me, I'm always trying to get clients to a point where they don't feel like they need to work with me anymore. And what more often is the case that happens is that people experience this deep healing that comes from this journey of depth, and then things become less painful, and all of the things that they're peeling back become increasingly lighter, and just there's a feeling of curiosity and interest and discovery, right? Rather than like drudging through all of this trauma. So it seems I'm not very good at getting rid of clients because you get to that point and it's an endless discovery, and it's pretty compelling.
Mm-hmm. So what got you interested in plant medicine? Because it's interesting. From my understanding, even in the psychotherapy world, psychology, psychiatry, especially in the 60s and 70s with the advent of LSD, there was a lot of research going into that. A lot of people really kind of swearing by the efficacy of it, of how it would really open people up. It maybe in your terms, open up their unconscious and allow them to see and work through these things. And then there was a real kind of pushback against it. But it's interesting because even I mean, I think that word is problematic in some degrees, psychedelic, but at its root, it essentially means the mind made manifest or the mind unveiled. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so,
Yeah.
in your own journey, what got you interested in plants? Was it the same kind of journey that got you interested in psychology and psychotherapy?
Let's see. There were a couple of different events. So right before I was slated to go to Asia, an article in the New Yorker came out, and it was writing about this, all of this research that had been taking place at Johns Hopkins University. And it was several years ago now, so I can't remember exactly, but I believe one of the pieces of research, one of the studies that they did was administering psilocybin mushrooms. So, you know, the active compound in magic mushrooms for people that don't know. And two terminally ill cancer patients, I think. And that there was something about both the dramatic efficacy that was being revealed that really caught my attention. So people that were wrestling with all of the pain and depression and anxiety of knowing that they're gonna die, not just, you know, in 3 decades or when the time is right or when I'm supposed to go, but like maybe in 6 months. And there was just a dramatic lifting of that depression, I think. And then furthermore, in the article, they included firsthand anecdotal, like maybe like journal entries of these patients. And I was really surprised that some of the experiences that these patients were describing were not dissimilar to my own experiences that I've had in deeper states of meditation. And so I was just, you know, these two areas of my life, which I'm so interested in healing and psychology, and also in this spiritual sense of meditation, both of them were really taken by this article. And I think the article said that the next study that Johns Hopkins was doing was on long-term meditators and psilocybin. And so I actually think that I immediately contacted them to see if I could be a part of it, because I was just like, what is this? Because before that point, I had no personal experience with any sort of substances. I don't know if it was because the way that I grew up, I never, I still have never smoked an actual cigarette, and I can't say that I've been drunk. And there was just this sense of, in my family, the idea of not needing to take a substance external to the body, the natural body, in order to heal something. And or to do anything, right? So an aside is that I recently asked my mother, who immigrated to the United States with my dad and my brother and I was 1 year old at the time, from Taiwan. And I recently asked her what was kind of the biggest culture shock that she had. And one of the first things she said was that all of her coworkers in this factory that she and my dad worked at carried Tylenol in their purses. And that was really shocking to her, that somebody would think about altering their chemistry in any way in order to feel less of a natural experience that's happening that might have some deeper significance or message perhaps from the body. And so that's the kind of household I grew up in. So I never had any interest in drugs or substance use. Again, not for any moralistic reason. I spent plenty of time in bars and smoky rooms because that's where my friends were, or that's where the good music was. But I myself never felt drawn to take something from the outside. So again, when I came across this article in the New Yorker, I was just floored by it. I was really blown away. And when I had come back from Asia, I realized that article had been expanded into a best-selling book, and that it was written by Michael Pollan, the best-selling author, who I had never read before, but I knew who he was. And this book called How to Change Your Mind was a further exposition of all of the various ways in which somebody could, in a more meaningful long-term manner, really change their minds. And so I was very drawn by that, and could see all of the growing body of research, and you're right, upon research, further research of my own, I could see that there was tons of it in the 60s and 70s, and then people got freaked out, and so it all stopped, and that it was actually in the last decade or so, or more recently, kind of coming back. And so all of these universities and major research institutions were doing this research and finding the results really promising, not just for anxiety or depression, but particularly with trauma, which I have a special interest in, was shockingly effective. So I was really interested in being like, okay, what is this? What is this? And also the piece around with trauma, the piece that was so effective was that it seemed to bypass that egoic thinking mind that likes to hold unconscious material at bay and just dredge it up in a way that is very difficult to do. It makes it hard for a person to do in a normal setting. Right? So it kind of seemed to me that key component of various psychedelic medicines was really, really useful, not just useful, but also really, I just wanted to see how that worked for myself. So I was just like, sign me up. I've done a lot of personal work, but I'm really interested to see what else is down there, any unconscious material that I still hadn't gotten to. I wanted to know what it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting experience. I mean, I can relate to that. And I think it's something a lot of people probably experience. And it's an interesting way of thinking that we don't need to take something from the outside, because we do that all of the time. I mean, every time we put a piece of food in our mouth, we're ingesting something that has certain chemicals, alkaloids, vitamins, minerals. And even things like meditation. I mean, as they study meditation more, that's also altering our brain chemistry. It's releasing certain endogenous chemicals in our body, which are very similar to many of these chemicals that are found in plants. It's also interesting with your mother coming from Taiwan, because I mean, traditional Chinese medicine really seems to be pointing to very similar things too, that kind of like a lot of traditional medicine, that things are there's a holistic way of working at things and or looking at things, and if something is out of balance, then certain diseases are going to manifest, and how do we take certain herbs or do certain practices in order to begin to bring those things into balance.
Exactly. My grandfather was actually a traditional Chinese medicine doctor.
Hmm,
So that probably explains it.
yeah. I mean, even these practices like Tai Chi, I mean, obviously there's a physical component to them, but I think most people who probably practice would argue, if anything, it's more of a mental practice of trying through physical movement to bring the mind into harmony. Um, so you got interested through the Johns Hopkins research. Um, what eventually so I met you in the Amazon at the Amazonian Plant Center, Temple of the Way of Light. Was that the first time you had worked with some sort of plant medicine?
Yeah, it was the first time that I had worked with any substance.
Mm-hmm. And so, what made you choose ayahuasca, and what made you choose that place in particularly?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't quite know because I don't think that it got much of a spotlight in Michael Pollan's book, or it wasn't particularly compelling to me in his own story. So in that book, for people who haven't read it, he actually experiments and takes in, ingests all of these various medicines, and then he writes about it travelogue style in the way that he's really good at. And ayahuasca, though, I think it's one of those things where it just is so strange because I didn't ever know anybody who had worked with it before. And and when I heard about it, it was sort of like, are people even doing this anymore in a way that's not just like completely touristy, and that would kind of feel like it was in the context of an approach that still held reverence for the culture from which it came, and for the healers that were providing it. And I don't know. I really don't know. I started researching it, and maybe a week later, I was in a workshop, and out of all the people in that workshop, I inexplicably was drawn to this woman, Ariel, and asked her to. So it was a holotropic breathwork workshop. So in that modality, you pair up with somebody, and that person is kind of your sitter for this 3-hour period where you're kind of trying to access these domains of consciousness that are not dissimilar to the ones that I've been talking about. So you really have to trust the person. So for whatever reason, I, without having spoken to her, asked her to be my person, and she was delighted to be the person. And we're still friends now, but at that point, I didn't know anything about her. And I found out maybe 2 days later that she and her husband had been having a really deep relationship with an ayahuasca healer, I think in the Netherlands or something. And it just felt like, okay, I've been researching this thing. I don't know anybody else who's done it. I trust you enough. That's enough for me to give it a go.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now that you mentioned holotropic breathwork, what was your experience like with that?
My experience with that was very similar to my first couple of ceremonies with ayahuasca, which I'm sure that you don't remember because you do thousands of them. But it's very kind of, not much is happening in the world of concept or images. My friend Ariel said the whole time I just had this smile on my face, which I wasn't aware of. I was told later by just the workshop facilitator that at some point I had been breaking out in this like belly laughter, and I have no conscious memory of that whatsoever. And then alternately at another point had been kind of moaning as if I were in deep despair about something. And I don't have any conscious memory of it.
Mm. You said you did it in a group setting. Did you see or feel that people were benefiting from that? I mean, I guess it's hard to say because you can't really see the long-term effects of it, but within the course of that workshop?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Even within the course of this 2-day weekend workshop, it actually felt that everybody was benefiting more than me because I was just like, I don't know, that was relaxing, right? So I think that's actually what gave me the extra push to be like, I need something stronger than this. But even from that holotropic breathwork, it seemed obvious that people were really accessing these deep traumas and memories, and that there was something about the field of camaraderie that was created, or the energy in general, where people felt really okay talking about it and being vulnerable and drawing from the strength of the group, not similar to the ceremonies at the temple.
Mm-hmm. I'm not super familiar with holotropic breath work, although I know a bit about it. But from my understanding, it was developed by Stanislav Grof kind of at the end of that area where people were beginning to work with LSD in therapeutic context, and then it became illegal. So he was kind of left in this position of how do I help clients without using that? And so he drew on a lot of ancient practices, Kriya work, breath work, of really trying to put people in those states where they were able to access a lot of those dormant or unconscious things.
Absolutely. He was actually a really renowned psychiatrist in Eastern Europe, I think the Czech Republic, and was basically recruited by some of the institutions in the United States at that time to continue doing this LSD as a therapeutic tool, research that he had been doing over in Europe, and did a lot of really compelling research up until the point of illegalization, and developed this practice directly in response to that. He really wanted to be able to access the same sorts of things without LSD.
So you ended up in the jungle at the Temple of Way of Light to work with ayahuasca. You had a pretty mild experience there too, right?
The first couple of ceremonies, and then the one I'm sure that everybody remembers there was an experience that I, before I had come, I had never read about an ayahuasca experience like that, and since I haven't. So yeah, it was one of the most compelling and also challenging experiences up to this point in my life.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel comfortable talking about that at all, or it's something that's also kind of beyond words? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel more comfortable talking about it. I can't guarantee that anybody can understand what I say. But Yeah, it was, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective, right? Because, oh man, when we're doing work like this with these plant medicines and with the holotropic breathwork, right? The idea is that your person, your sitter, you want somebody kind of on the other side, uh, holding the kite string, so to speak, as you perhaps expand into these different states of consciousness, and just kind of watching over and taking care of you when anything comes up. And I think it's safe to say that you really wrangled that kite. And there was a crazy experience. It's really hard to believe for myself and anybody even that was witnessing it, but I was completely unconscious, so this is just from other people's observations. I basically was just doing these crazy gymnastics, like very acrobatic, very um, difficult maneuvers that were actually harmful to my body, including banging my head on the floor. Who knows what would have happened if you hadn't come over and put me in a headlock. And I don't know. So that was from the outside. Internally, I was having an experience that mirrored that. But when I said I was unconscious, I didn't have any connection in between that inner world and the outer world until I started coming down from it. And that part was actually the most difficult, to be flipping in between these two worlds and just not having a sense of true reality.
Mhm. So what do you think you ended up taking from that experience, or what do you think that did for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a deeply felt sense, even as I was coming down, that it was deeply meaningful, what had happened, and that I would continue to be integrating it for a long period of time, maybe even years. And something that I think for me was so important was to see that there had been this element of my spiritual search there was still a very, you get to this point where it's like you're like shedding all of these various egoic identities, essentially, and you're working through all of this, and you're getting closer to this recognition of who we all really are inside. And I think there was a part of me that didn't foresee the existence of uh, this kind of spiritual healer ego for myself. So I didn't realize that even the act of seeking to work with plant medicine was a manifestation of this egoic part of me that was saying, okay, once you get to the final layer of unconscious material, you can really be fully free, right? Something like that. And this experience with ayahuasca just was showing me that it doesn't feel like I have any of that unconscious material on an individual personality level, or any that's important for me to work through anymore. And that particularly tough ceremony that we're talking about showed me this. It was kind of what we call transpersonal, right? So it's kind of going beyond that individual psyche level. So it not only showed me that, you know, hey, Tsu-Yin, there's nothing wrong with you anymore. Just like, just be happy. And you're on the right path. Just, you really don't need to be seeking in any way outside of yourself. I had really felt that deeply in the last few years, but there was still remnants of that, obviously, in this. And then this experience showed me that it was an experience of what we call non-duality. So there's not a separation between me as the experiencer or the observer, what's happening, and that's being observed. There's no in here or out there. It's all combined. So I'm at once the person, not person, the something that's experiencing everything, and I'm the thing that's being experienced. And it was happening. It was very obvious to me that at some point the medicine was just like, hey, if there's any way that you had still been idealizing some sort of non-dual state or final enlightenment or anything like that, like, here's an experience of it that's completely terrifying and incorporates all the pain in the world, in the cosmos, across the ages. And this is part of it, all right? It's not just like we get to enlightenment and then it's bliss until the end. That's not it at all. So I think it was deeply helpful in my spiritual journey and understanding, and as well as on a personal level.
So, coming from this psychotherapeutical background and having worked with something like ayahuasca and going into a really deep experience, do you have a sense on a more personal level now of how these plants like ayahuasca or psilocybin potentially could be aiding people in that type of work?
Yeah, very much so. I was so compelled by it, and could see so much the therapeutic value of it that I applied to become part of this training for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So MDMA is otherwise known as ecstasy and is one of these many substances that have been receiving a lot of attention and research dollars thrown at it. And I would say MDMA is, let me think about this. Yeah, I think is the closest out of all of them to be approved as a therapeutic medicine by the US Food and Drug Administration. So I was really compelled by this research that this organization MAPS had been doing, which is a nonprofit organization that has been investing in and trying to develop the therapeutic potential of MDMA for, I don't know, like 3.5 decades. And with this recent resurgence in interest in psychedelic medicine, they've really been, I would say, supported by sort of the mainstream establishments, both psychiatrists, psychologists, governmentally, And I think it's because, so something that's really interesting is that support of this research and kind of ushering it into it being available for public use seems to be irrespective of who is in the White House politically. So a lot of currently they're with MDMA, they're in phase 3 of clinical trials. And they started phase 2 like way even before Obama was president. And there doesn't seem to be any stopping of that. And Trump has remained very supportive, and seemingly whoever wins the election, big question coming up, won't affect this. And I think that the reason that is because it's so obvious the therapeutic potential for veterans who suffer deeply in our country, and the trauma that they experience is the PTSD that people normally think about when they think of trauma. Like it's very debilitating. So the research was really promising. The last piece that just came out in June was that they had done a follow-up study of people that had already gone through this protocol a year later, and 2/3 of all people who had an average of 18 years of PTSD no longer a year later met criteria for PTSD. Wow. So that's pretty amazing. And so seeing the fact that this was not just effective, but also being accepted in this mainstream way made me really interested in looking into it. I myself have never worked with MDMA, but I feel like I have a sense of what it would be like just going through the training with my experience with plant medicine. And when it does come on the market, it's will only be available it will only be administered in the context of this clinical setting. It's not like somebody writes you a prescription and then you go home and take it, right? It's that you come to this clinical setting, there's all of this training, there's multiple people there, it's a set structure of dosage and administration, as well as, really importantly, the integration sessions that help people make sense of all the unconscious material that is coming up. And like I said, it tends to bypass the normal gatekeeper of the thinking mind, and some thinking minds don't like that afterwards. So there's a lot in there, and it definitely requires people knowing what they're doing, and the therapists that are administering it, and being able to be skilled therapists even before they worked with this tool. So I'm currently in a multi-year-long program because once it comes on the market, only FDA-approved training, or therapists with FDA-approved training, will be able to administer it. And so I'm in one of those trainings right now.
Mm. So 2/3 success rate. I mean, that, from your experience, I mean, have you seen anything that has kind of those results? I mean, because I mean, obviously, still a third of people aren't, but I mean, that's seemingly a pretty staggering number too. The 2 out of 3 people go from however many years with symptoms to symptom free.
Yeah, no, I have not. I have not seen anything like it. It is staggering. And I think the reason why MDMA and actually psilocybin too have been designated breakthrough therapies by the FDA, which just means that there's a staggering amount of evidence showing their efficacy, treating something that there's very low recovery rates around normally. So I think anybody who's looking into this and seeing the research recognizes like this needs to happen. So with the breakthrough designation, also something called expanded access, this research is getting kind of moved along, almost like fast-tracked in a way that normal processes of getting medicines on the market don't benefit from. So maybe in as close as soon as 18 months, we might get there.
Wow. So in order to partake in that program, does one need certain qualifications? Does one need to be a psychologist, psychiatrist, or what are the requisites for that?
Yeah, you do need to be a licensed therapist. Could be a psychiatrist, could be psychologist, could be licensed mental health clinician or something else, but you do have to be licensed and practicing, and it's kind of difficult because of the protocol around it. It's not like after I get this certification, I then on my own can have a client visit me in my office downtown and then do it. Like I said, it's structured so that you're at a setting where somebody can spend the night. There's 2 licensed and trained therapists there. There's all sorts of things that are required by this to make things safe for people. And for example, here in Boston, I'm part of a team of therapists and psychiatrists who it's a really great group of people who I trust and respect, and we just really get along, who are set up at a particular place in Boston that meets all of these requirements, and so you're administering this medicine as a team.
Mm. And so is that something you see yourself integrating into your practice, maybe for certain cases, or do you think it's something completely separate that people will come to you in a different way, or how do you see yourself proceeding with that?
Great question. Like I said, I don't spend a lot of time looking into the future. So I'll answer the question, but it could look totally different at some point. But at this point, I feel like initially, I think that they will be separate, because when there will be a very strong, there will be specific criteria for people that are able to receive MDMA. And at the beginning, I think that it will require somebody to have this very, very severe PTSD, like one that interferes with daily functioning or daily relationships, holding down a job, things like that. And those aren't the clients that I see in my private practice typically. And the ones that I see are extraordinarily high functioning, have like their dream jobs, and are just not happy still. So there's a disparity between the clientele, I think, the demographic. But I don't know what will happen over time. I think probably when people find out that this is on the market and it's available, people will start looking more into it, and they might find out that I have this training, and there might be some sort of connection that happens through that. But I really don't know.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's potential for your clientele, for example, someone who isn't happy with their job, which some people may describe as something existential? They, as you said before, they realize something is wrong, but they maybe can't necessarily put words onto it. Do you think something like MDMA or psilocybin or some of these other plants or alkaloids would have potential with someone like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right, because I feel like everybody has, if it's not kind of like an unearthing of this unconscious material, it's very unusual for somebody to have dug all of that up in one lifetime, let's say. And so if it's not that, there at least is this other element that the folks on the initial study Johns Hopkins study I was reading about in the New Yorker several years ago with the terminally ill patients, the reason why those patients were able to release fear, for example, as they're facing mortality, is because they had a direct experiential taste, at least, of what's underneath all of this stuff, right? And to really align oneself and see who we truly are through any means is deeply healing. Mm-hmm. So anybody could benefit.
You mentioned, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I just want to say anybody could benefit, and with the caveat that it's like anybody could benefit from a drink after work, right? It's sort of like you want to be really clear on your relationship to the thing, right? Because it's whether something is helpful, not helpful, good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, is not really inherent to that thing. It really lies in your relationship to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And it seems like there's also a lot of newer research coming out that's really showing that or pointing towards that. Because it seems like even when I was growing up, there was the whole war on drugs and just say no, and this idea that the drug or the chemical, the alkaloid itself, was somehow inherently addictive. Which it seems like if anyone was really to think about that, that wouldn't make sense, because that would mean anyone who took that would be addicted to it. Much in the same way, if we say you fall off a 30-story building, you're most likely going to break your leg, and that can be replicated. certain impact is going to cause a certain injury. But what can be seen with so many substances is some people may develop an addictive relationship to it, and many people don't. Um, and there's so many things where that could happen with. It could be a substance, it could be coffee, tea, but it doesn't have to be. It could be work or sex or football or anything. We can develop that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because that seems like a really big point in moving forward with this work, is that, it seems like for a long time, probably for all sorts of reasons, propaganda, political reasons, but these substances were shown to be addictive in and of themselves, which it seems like what a lot of the modern research is showing is that it's not. Just like, as you said, there's a relationship, and in that relationship, something addictive is formed, most likely because the person is suffering, or use the word trauma. Someone is lacking something is in a state of dis-ease, and so they reach to something seemingly filling that hole, but it's essentially just temporarily bringing relief to the symptom, but then the person has to keep going back to that thing because it's not actually getting to the root of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you just said it. It's if a person is in a place where it's easiest to just reach for that temporary relief, right? And either they're not equipped, or they don't have the tools, or it's too overwhelming, or they just don't want to go deeper than that, then what looks like an addictive relationship will surely follow, because that's your only tool when you're feeling out of sorts, right? And like you said, it can be anything that can become addictive if used in this way, even meditation, right? Even spirituality, the most quote unquote wholesome or healthy things, right? And a lot of people, I see a lot of people coming to spirituality from that place, right? Using meditation as a way to kind of not have to feel their feelings, right? Because anybody that's done even a little bit of quote unquote successful meditation will realize that there is a calming effect. There is a settling of the mind that happens when you focus it in such a way that it's not running amok, thinking of all of the things that are going to happen next week, or all the terrible conversations that happened last month, or whatever, right? So there is that calming effect. So it would be really easy to, whenever those things are coming up for a person, just be like, don't want to think about it, let's go meditate. And there's even a phrase for it called spiritual bypassing, where you're using spirituality to bypass the very things that you actually need to become very intimate with in order to access the deeper truths that will give you the long-lasting relief that you're likely looking for to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that's worth emphasizing again, is because I've seen that a lot myself. And you take something like a diet, maybe a raw food diet or a vegan diet, or doing yoga. And even though there's benefits to that, many people do develop an addictive relationship to that. And I often find a marker that kind of shows that, is if that's ever pointed out, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to that. That there's a fighting, or a latching out. And I think that's a really good sign that potentially something has developed into an addictive relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have to be really careful to uh, bring as much self-awareness as we can to anything, really, but particularly with usage of something like, for sure, ayahuasca, because there's a lot that can happen there. Um, but any sort of thing that we're doing, even if it seems on the outset like it's a really good, helpful, healing thing. Um, and I think that as long as we understand that all of these things are just useful tools, right? They're not, this is what I'm going to do forever. But they're tools. Even all of the religious practices that people engage in, whether it's a spiritual practice of meditation or something else, the point is not to then be in meditation formally 24/7 for the rest of your life, right? It's actually pointing you towards something else. And as long as we approach medicines in this way, whether it's ayahuasca, MDMA, anything else, I don't know, even something like going out with friends can become addictive, right? If you're using it as a way to avoid the sense of loneliness that you might have if you're just by yourself, and that loneliness is intolerable or connected to some other important piece that you could really benefit from healing, right? So if we are aware, we need to be aware as much as we can about what our motivations and intentions are at any given moment, and maintain the proper relationship to these things that are helping us. They're really stepping stones. They're not the final answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. You mentioned potentially with MDMA, 18 months, it may actually be in its next phase. You also mentioned psilocybin. Do you have any insight or any thoughts about how that may begin to progress?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not my wheelhouse. A lot of people I know would could call up right now and they could answer this question easily. But I don't. I'm more familiar with what's going on with MDMA, even kind of all of the specific details. Somebody actually, so right now with the MDMA research, there's 15 study sites across the world, where these clinical trials are taking place. Like I said, we're in phase 3, but and one of those sites is in Boston. So somebody from one of the sites actually just reached out to me to gauge my interest, I think, in participating in this next phase of the study, which is this safety. It's kind of making sure that no really adverse effects are going to happen to people, and that's we're nearing the end, right? Because we've presumably already proved the efficacy, and so now this is the safety, and the data that comes from that will be deemed by the FDA as like sufficient to proceed or not. So that's how I know more specifically 18 months, just feeling things out. But if I hadn't had that phone call and talked to some people, I really want to know. I would just feel like we're on the cusp. And I feel that way about psilocybin for sure.
Mm-hmm.
That
Do you
is
think that,
close.
so you think that'll probably be the next one after MDMA?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something which is one of the reasons you were drawn to go to the Amazon and work at the Temple of the Way of Light was this idea of tradition and these people who really have a deep knowledge of these plants. And you use this word woo woo too. You know, it's actually grounded in reality. It's grounded in their experience. I mean, they're doctors. Um, how do you view that? Because obviously that's something that was very important to you. And then, it kind of also this idea of we are at the cusp of something of using these plants or these chemicals in this new way, which many people would say is kind of lacking in a tradition or in a context. So how do you feel those things can be bridged?
Yeah. I think that they have to be, but I can't tell you how that will look. I think the fact that this is happening, this recognition from the more traditionally medical, Western empirical establishment, uh, looking into and accepting uh, these things that they would even still like just gut reflexively consider woo-woo because we're just so trained to think that way. I do too. It's deep in my blood. I worked in psychology and depression research, my first job out of school. I have this researcher's mind. It's again, I had no context with spirituality before. The things that I believe now, I absolutely would not believe if I myself didn't personally experience them, even though I'm a very open-minded person. And I trust that my teachers and other people that have experiences, but there's something deep within me that's trained to be skeptical, right? So I think the reason why I'm confident, though, that there will be a bridging is because the same thing, the same question, it's already happened with something like mindfulness or yoga. So there's a lot around, well, what are you guys doing taking mindfulness out of the religious context, right? What are the potential drawbacks of that and what are the benefits? And we're seeing both, where it's just revealing itself. And I think that in general, the people that have benefited from mindfulness taken out of the religious context would say, I never would have experienced the benefits of mindfulness had I had to believe certain things, affiliate myself with particular religious tradition, right? And I'm in that category. I would not have touched any of this stuff with a 10-foot pole had I not just stumbled into it because I was looking for a stress reduction tool so many years ago. Well, I mean, what's interesting is once you get deep enough into it, it kind of pulls you into it. So never in my wildest dreams thought I would be going to live in monasteries in Asia, right? Right now, so when things got locked down in Boston in March, I had one book from the library, and it was this text called A Course in Miracles. So I've had it for 6 months now because the libraries have been closed. And it's this like almost 600-page spiritual text that was transcribed, I think, in the 80s by this psychologist, psychology professor at Columbia University, who also didn't have any spiritual or religious background herself, but kind of produced this through seemingly what the empirical mind would say is impossible circumstances, produced this 600-page text that when I was reading it feels completely different from my sense of modern day Christianity, yet it utilizes the Christian terms, Christian vocabulary. So it's actually the first time that I felt like I understood Christianity. And there was this recognition that, you know, so what I was talking about before with the egoic mind, it's actually very difficult to understand what that actually means. It's the term that my clients have the most difficulty really comprehending, because it's hard to understand unless you actually already know what it means. So it's this sense of everything that's happening in the psychological mind and the emotional mind that reinforces this idea that you are completely separate from everything and everybody around you in the world. And that from that place of separateness, you have to compete to survive, you have to fight over resources, you really have to gain the approval of other people in order to feel loved or worthy. And that's just like an initial little dip into it, but it's very crucial in really experientially understanding what that actually is. I think definitely in Buddhism, but I think in any of the world's religious traditions and wisdom traditions. And when I was reading this huge book, I finally recognized, oh, actually each of these world's traditions have some way that they're trying to refer to that separate, cut off, fragmented sense of self that stands in the way of you understanding or feeling a deeper truth of interconnectedness, perhaps. And in Buddhism, when we say that somebody is really self-identified with that egoic sense of self, is the equivalent in Christianity seems to me, during my research during lockdown, seems to me to be equivalent to living in sin. And that just totally blew my mind, because you know, who knows what was happening like culturally and etymologically back then when they came up with these terms like sin, forgiveness, guilt, atonement, because we have a completely different relationship to those words now, and they're very prone to misinterpretation in this spiritual sense. So I just was so amazed and delighted to see, like, oh, actually this text, this what I feel like is a very true expression of Christianity is actually completely aligned with Buddhism, at least early Buddhism that I've spent a lot of time studying and living in a felt way. And there just is this confusion around it. So I think I'm bringing that up back to this question of how to integrate basically the old and the new, right? The traditional and the modern. And I think that this is something that each age of time contends with, right? So even the way that I learned meditation in this Burmese context in Myanmar is very different. I'm positive of what it was like even 75 years ago, even 100 years ago. So each new culture and time is going to influence these things. And I think that that's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that fascinating, this idea of interconnectedness. And also from my perspective, it seems like all of these teachings were pointing towards the same thing. And obviously that's a huge rabbit hole to get into about where these things started. And but yeah, even from my understanding, the word sin, etymologically, it comes from this idea to miss the mark. And they would often use the idea of archery, which is we're essentially trying to hit the bullseye in good faith, but we almost never do. We're always a little bit off center. We're a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. And so that's to sin. But it's not coming from a bad place. It's coming from the human condition that we all sin all the time. And the idea of evolution or spiritual evolution is constantly trying to bring it back to center, which is very much like this Buddhist concept of the middle way, trying not to veer too far to the right or too far to the left, which interestingly is the definition of yoga. It's the same thing, to yoke, to steer. When you were plowing a field with the oxen, it doesn't know a straight line, so it's going to go a little bit to the right. So you pull it back to the left. It goes too far to the left. You bring it back to the right, and it's fascinating how really worldviews can arise from these concepts. Another one I find fascinating is apocalypse. And we have this idea that it's the end of time, and it's from our sins. But the root of apocalypse means to lift the veil, and it's very similar to
really?
uh,
Wow.
the Hindu or Vedic concept of Maya, which means which is really the same thing. Like
Yeah.
in Myanmar, maybe it's probably Vipassana, maybe you're referring to, which is the same thing, to see things how they actually are. And so actually the apocalypse was something that the human being desires, because it's the end of the world, but it's the end of the illusory world. It's the end of the beliefs and the judgment and the all of these things that keep us from being truly interconnected. Um,
Yeah.
another really fascinating one I was reading about recently, um, because very much like the work of plant work, which I see very much takes on these mythological forms and these archetypical stories, that like the hero's journey. And one of the really common ones with that is this idea, and you see it in many traditions, many myths all over the world, is the hero's journey where he or she has to go into the cave, the darkness, and eventually fight and slay the dragon. And dragon, apparently, it's related to the word of serpent. And in cultures all over the world, you have this idea of serpent. And the dragon is one of the forms of that. But that actually serpent, its etymology comes from this idea of light, which is quite the opposite of what we would usually think about it. And it means light, and also to reflect back. So actually the entire journey into the cave to slay the dragon is essentially looking at a mirror and having the light reflected back. And that we see that it was
Wow.
never the dragon in the beginning. It was ourself that we have to actually look at. And so, yeah, I
Right.
think, yeah, these things are, they're so fascinating. Iboga, which is a plant I've worked with, one of the early things that you do is you look in a mirror and
Right.
you stare at that deeply. And even these ideas of like with Iboga, the first ceremony is the death ceremony. It's going into death, and what does that reveal? It leads to the next ceremony, which is the rebirth. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So fascinating. Absolutely. I think that there is another one that comes to mind is the story of the Holy Grail. It's like this the Grail King is sending his knights on the search for the Holy Grail, and it's supposed to be accessed in this forest. And the instruction that he gives is enter where it is the darkest, and there is no path. And you kind of hear that and you're just like, why would I want to go where it's darkest in the forest? Why would I want to find a place that has no path? How could I find it? But yet there's this understanding that there's something valuable, very valuable, that can be found through these instructions. And in fact, the forest is a metaphor for nirvana, for enlightenment itself. And darkness is a metaphor for the unknown, which by itself is not spooky or dangerous. It just feels that way to the smaller, separate sense of self. So that's where all of this resistance comes from. And that's also where all of this freedom and liberation comes from, when you are able to basically tolerate the unknown, tolerate ambiguity, and not just tolerate, like really, once that's just the initial step of it, once you open into it, you begin to even thrive with the unknown. And I think that I it is so difficult to convince somebody that that's even worth thinking about or practicing, but we need only look to what's happening with the coronavirus to see how much anguish and pain comes from not being able to know what's going to happen, know why this is happening, right? Who did this? Is this really dangerous? Is this actually killing as many people as we think it is? All of these unknown questions. Now, this week, it's like, what will schools opening look like? And who's going to win the election, right? These deeply important questions, I think, but I think for the first time we're confronted with an impossibility of answering, and that is so foreign and unsettling for most of us, that we're really struggling globally.
Mm-hmm. So do you think, I mean, obviously you've become really interested in this work. It's become part of your life. Do you see this really affecting the world of psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy? Do you think, you mentioned this idea of a cusp? I mean, do you think we are on the cusp of something different, something that has the ability to really change the profession, or the way that people are worked with, how we view mental health, these things of integration and understanding trauma, and even potentially integrating other things like having a different realization of what religion is or what spirituality is? Do you think these things are kind of coming together to potentially really transform or enhance that?
that appears to be the case. Are you asking about coronavirus's potential to do this, or plant medicine?
No, more the plant medicine, like the work you're doing
Okay.
with MDMA, and yeah.
Yeah,
We'll
because
leave
I actually
coronavirus to
think
another.
I actually think coronavirus is doing this as well,
Mhm.
and that there's a way in which it is just like plant medicines are able to do, kind of bypass something that we would volitionally choose for ourselves in order to see something deeper in our history and our collective uh, consciousness that are really important to reckon with in order for something new to come through. So I think that just like all of this work with psychology, with the plant medicine, with meditation, that stuff doesn't feel very good. It's not stuff that we would choose for ourselves or choose for anybody else. But I do know that on a deep level, real deep transformation is never possible without the reckoning of the stuff that stood in the way of that transformation to begin with. So I have a deep faith and appreciation, actually, for all of the pain that we're suffering through, because I've seen this is how it goes. This is the transformative power of really coming to terms with things that we've wanted to deny the whole time. And I think what's happening with plant medicine, what's happening with the coronavirus are not separate things. It's all part of the whole. This is the shift that is required right now. Otherwise, it wouldn't be happening. It's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, great. Well, is there anything else you'd like to touch on? I think we're actually coming up on almost 3 hours.
Oh my God. No. I want to express appreciation for you, Jason. Just with my own personal experience down at the temple, and I know that this has come up many times in your podcasts, and it comes up in its own version with therapists, but we're in great positions of power in our roles when people come to us, right? Really vulnerable states that people are in. And if we're not clear in our intentions, firm in our groundedness and our presence, and quite honestly have the skill, regardless of training, then we have great potential to do more harm than good. So I don't want to scare people off from trying exploring different healing modalities, and it's already, everyone knows that it's impossible to find a good therapist, so I don't want to discourage people any more than they already are, but I just want to express appreciation for you and your the standards that you hold, and as well as at the Temple of the Way of Light. It was very obvious to me when I was down there.
Oh, well, thank you. If people want to get in touch with you, are you taking on new clients? Is there a way they can get in touch with you if that's a possibility?
Yeah. I'd love people to get in touch with me regardless. I'm not taking on new clients. I work with a very small handful at any given time just to ensure that I'm as grounded and as present as possible. And I don't like working when I'm not doing my best work for everybody in any given session. But I do have a wait list, and I'd encourage people to contact me about things that aren't related to becoming my client as well. I absolutely enjoy connecting in that way with folks. And the best way would be through my website. It's www.mindfullivingcenter.org, but there's dashes in between mindful living and center.
Okay. Yeah, we'll put up the link in the show notes too, in case anyone didn't get that. And is it only for people in the Boston area, or people can reach out from anywhere?
Yeah, so only folks who are so the way that licensing happens in the psychotherapeutic field is that you're only licensed to practice in the state that you can only practice in the state that you're licensed in. So I'm licensed in Washington, Seattle, Washington, that area, as well as Massachusetts. So if it's therapeutic work specifically that people are looking for, then those are the parameters there. But I do work with people just through the internet that are interested in gaining support for mindfulness. So meditation, coaching, figuring things out, questions about spirituality, that sort of thing. So anybody is welcome to reach out in that way.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate that. And
thanks for having me.
So I'm sure there's a lot more we could do. So maybe we'll do another one sometime in the future.
Okay, I would be happy to speak with you again. It's been fun.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Tsu-Yin.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, take good care.
Okay, everybody. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I've got some good guests coming up in the next couple episodes. I'm not exactly sure the order that's going to happen, but it will be people who actually work with these plants. So there's some really good guests coming up. As always, if you can go on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, go on Apple Podcasts, leave a starred rating and a review. That would be really helpful. And if you're able to give back in any way to help to support this show, either through direct donation or Patreon is a really good format. For just a few dollars a month, you can subscribe and you get access to a lot of additional material, bonus episodes, Q&As, things like that. So it's a really good way to help to support this show and to get something back. So for all of those who have donated and are part of Patreon, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I will see all of you guys on the next episode.
Tung